everyone, welcome back to the Storytime family. How's it going? I hope you've been well and taking good care of yourself and your family. Have you gone to play outside yet? Or is it a rainy day and you're sitting down reading a book with us? Well, whatever it is, I'm glad you're taking the time out to read. Today we have Mr. Grot and His Barrel of Snot by Nadya Luise and illustrated by Peter Ryan. Let's get started. Mr. Grot and His Barrel of Snot. Mr. Grot had a barrel of snot. No one knew why. No one could not figure out why he had a barrel of snot. He lived in a cave, suited only for the brave. He had no shower, he had no sink, which explains why he would always stink. He liked to use words like because and whomever. Mr. Grot thought he was terribly clever. He kept a small cage overflowing with birds, tall ones, short ones, you mark my words. But there was one thing wrong, one thing array. The birds had few feathers and could not fly. The poor birds shook and shivered in their cage, too scared to tweet or misbehave. Every morning Mr. Grot would sit at his table with a coffee pot. He ate cake and muffins and strawberry pie, and then he'd comb his hair and straighten his tie. He would feed the birds with the leftover crumbs, then pluck the feathers right out of their bums. Out for a walk down the street he would go in search of more snot, you know. With a feather in hand he would spy a young child. He would tickle their nose, then run and hide. The child would scratch and they'd shake. Mr. Grot would patiently wait. Ah, ah, 1. Ah, ah, 2. The child would sneeze. Ah, choo! As the child sneezed and the snot flew, Mr. Grot knew just what to do. With a roll and a tumble, he pulled out the tissue. The townsfolk turned round to see what's the issue. Such perfect technique, not losing a drop. People watch in awe from the coffee shop. Stuffing the tissue in a jar, he ran down the road yelling, "Au revoir!" But then one day he messed with the wrong kid. Mr. Grot tickled, but wished he never did. This boy in particular, he was the sneeziest. His name was Alfred Marcus Deazius. Alfred was small, but packed a bite. Look out anyone who gave him a gripe. Alfred marched to Mr. Grot's place with grimace and anger all over his face. He knocked and he tapped, he pounded like thunder, but silence lay still, and Alfred began to wonder. Where, oh where is that snotty, grotty man? The man who scratched kids' noses and ran. Spotting a window sitting ajar, Alfred climbed and fell in a jar. Yes, he fell in a jar, for it was a trap. Mr. Grot appeared and started to clap. A friend, it's too good to be true. Welcome, my friend, and how do you do? It all became clear. It all became true. Mr. Grot was lonely, this Alfred knew. Scratching his head, Alfred had to ask, why, oh why do you perform this task? Why collect snot and keep it in a barrel? And why so wearing such fine apparel? Mr. Grot looked down at his fancy dress. You know, I've always liked to dress to impress. But what of the birds trapped in the cage? Asked little Alfred, beginning to rage. Those poor birds, those featherless fellows, demanded Alfred, beginning to bellow. Mr. Grot looked confused and became rather sad. Have I been terribly, terribly bad? A tear trickled down Mr. Grot's grubby cheek. He touched one bird and stroked its beak. I'm sorry, my friend, my loyal breed. I fear my selfishness has been bad indeed. It started with 1 feather, then 2, 3, and 4. My fascination with Snot kept me coming back for more. Please excuse me now, for I must flee. Mr. Grot's grim face transformed into glee. He turned to exit out the front door. I'm afraid this is becoming a terrible bore. Alfred thought quickly and opened the cage. The birds flew at Mr. Grot in a spat of rage. They came at him with the few remaining feathers. They tickled his nose all together. One big tickle has to make one big sneeze. Mr. Grot scratched and began to wheeze. Achoo! And across the room Mr. Grot flew. Across the room in his fine apparel, Mr. Grot headed straight for the barrel. The very barrel of Snot, overflowing and yuck, splashed Mr. Grot into the depths of his muck. Alfred grimaced, so too did the birds. Mr. Grot was lost for words. Well, serves you right, you nincompoop. Now you're covered in all that goop. The birds looked to Alfred and gave him the nod. Alfred picked up the barrel and tossed it down. The barrel, it rolled all the way into town. The townsfolk looked on in awe at the scene. Mr. Grot became dizzy and his face turned green. The barrel raced through the cobbled lanes. Fear and terror rushed through Mr. Grot's veins. The barrel ricocheted off a skating ramp and caused much trouble at the local scout camp. It went up a hill and around many bends. Mr. Grot shouted, "Oh, when will it end?" Then suddenly the barrel got stuck in some mud. Mr. Grot heard tweeting and felt a big thud. Through the opening of the barrel something appeared, something long and fluffy. It touched his beard. With a rapid movement, it tickled his nose. Mr. Grot shuddered and then he froze. One. Two. Mr. Grot sneezed and the barrel, it blew. It blew into pieces thanks to a feather. Alfred and the birds stood strong together. Mr. Grot stood and wiped down his clothes. He straightened his tie and blew his nose. You have made your point, Mr. Grot said. Then he turned on his wheels and away he fled. No one saw Mr. Grot after that day. That day Alfred and the birds cried, "Hip, hip, hooray!" Alfred and the birds became best friends. Even their bottoms were well on the mend. Their feathers grew back and they started to sing. Alfred was grateful for one very thing. If it wasn't for that horrible Mr. Grot and his equally horrible barrel of Snot, Alfred would not have met his feathered friends. And this, my dear reader, is how the story ends. Achoo! And that was Mr. Grot and his barrel of Snot. That was a pretty long story, right? But did you enjoy it? If you'd like to own a copy of this book, the links are in the description below. If you enjoyed our stories and would like to hear more, do subscribe and give us a like and leave us a comment. We always love to hear from you. We'll see you again soon. You take care of yourself and your family. Bye-bye.